The tape segments, which you are about to see, have been selected from a group of 25 interviews which have been made by the Pioneers of Science and Technology Videotape Project. The objective of the project is to obtain videotape interviews of 100 men who during the past half-century were responsible for the advancements in science and technology which have revolutionized our lives. They are being placed in the archives of the University of California, MIT, and the University of Maryland. These 10-minute segments have been selected from the tapes of 6 individuals. The emphasis in these segments is primarily, but not exclusively, on the early background of the interviewee. The following tapes will be shown. 1, Dr. Carl Gerasi, National Inventors Hall of Fame, Syntex President, developer of cortisone and the birth control pill. This segment is unique in that it records the superb artwork in his office and, incidentally, some of the trials and tribulations in setting up the interview. 3, Chet Hollifield, pioneer in atomic energy legislation. 3, Bertrand Goldschmidt, French nuclear pioneer who started work with Madame Curie. 4, Stephen Bechtel, organizer of large-scale engineering projects. 5, David Packard, pioneer in electronics and the electronics industry. And 6, Linus Pauling's description of his work on vitamins. The tapes will now be shown in that order. Yeah. Sort of his model stuff.
This is really a striking thing. Can't see it too well, but
It's all right. We just do the best you can. You get a flavor of it now.
scientists are very often artists.
I'd like it out of the way.
Well, I guess that's the best we can do. Okay.
Well, that's not bad. You can't complain about that.
No, that's pretty interesting. 'Cause, 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 'cause,
schooling, what got me
Yes,
into
a brief where you were born. We know you were born you were born in Vienna, I believe.
Yes.
And some of your early schooling and things like that.
Well, I was born in Vienna in 1923, but that was really an accident. My parents were both physicians. My mother was Viennese, my father was Bulgarian, and they met in medical school. And after they got married, moved to Bulgaria. When my mother was pregnant, she felt the only reasonable place to have a child born in the world medically at that particular time was Vienna. So when she was, 7, 8 months pregnant, she went back to Vienna to deliver the child in the hospital in which I guess she did her internship or residency. So I was born in Vienna, and then when I was 2 months old, we returned to Bulgaria.
Yes, of course. Vienna has been an outstanding pioneer in medical science throughout history.
But in the early part of the century, first 20 years or so, it was really, of the century, it was really probably the medical school in Europe.
Yes.
And so I was born in Vienna. I lived the first 5 years of my life in Bulgaria. And then when it was time for me to go to school, that time my mother moved back to Vienna, my parents got divorced, and I went to school in Vienna until age 14 or 15, and sort of spent the summers in Bulgaria with my father, and until Hitler days, until the Nazis got into Austria, and then I went to an American school in Bulgaria.
Oh yeah.
That doesn't exist anymore. It was a marvelous school. It was part of these American schools in the Near East, like American University in Beirut, and Roberts College in Istanbul, and the American College in Sofia. These were the 3 schools. So I went to that one, and so that was good for me in terms of learning English. And shortly after the outbreak of the war in December 1939, I came here to this country with my mother. My father stayed in Bulgaria until after the war and only came to this country in 1949 or 1950. So I came to this country at age 16, and the school that I told you that I went to was called American College. Now, that was a formal name. It was really the equivalent of the European Gymnasium or Real Gymnasium, and I should have, of course, continued here in high school. When I came here to this country, one of the American teachers at the American College gave me the name of someone, a friend of his who taught at NYU, New York University, and said he might help me find where to go to school or give me some advice. So I went there, and within a few minutes realized that the man was assuming that I was already a college student and not, I really had just started a junior year of high school.
Yes, so nomenclature.
Right, but you also want to remember that Central European gymnasiums were really for the higher caliber than the average high school here. For instance, I had already had 5 years of Latin, just to give you an example.
Oh, yeah.
So I took him up on this, and he said, well, he pointed out that I couldn't get into NYU. It was the middle of the semester, but he had a friend teaching at Newark Junior College in Newark, New Jersey. And why didn't I go over there, get some advice from them? And they admitted me. I was a very good student. I had been a very good student at the American College in Sofia. And, I was reasonably fluent in English, although I had an even heavier accent than I have now. And so they accepted me. So next thing I knew, I was a freshman in college rather than a junior in high school. So I skipped 2 years of high school and never graduated from high school. And that, of course, was a major saving for me. So I ended up in Newark, New Jersey. I had never been, I had no burning interest in chemistry. I didn't blow up basements, so I didn't have any experimental laboratory kits. But I'd always assumed that I'd go into medicine. Both my parents were, physicians, and so I took the usual pre-medical curriculum. And right there, in my first year at Newark Junior College, I had a very stimulating teacher named Washington, who really turned me on in chemistry, a very stimulating chemistry teacher. Now, at that time, junior college was not yet as common as it's now, and I planned right away how to go and what to do afterwards. And there were two institutions in the United States at that time, Kenyon College in Ohio and the University of Chicago, that had special fellowships or scholarships for junior college graduates. And I applied to these toward the end of my first year. And at the same time, not the same time, really early, and I discovered it only recently by going through my files. Just when I came to the United States, I had written to Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt. This was sort of typical naivete of a European kid to whom Eleanor Roosevelt was sort of the Queen of America, you know, to whom everything was possible, and she really personified, I think, everything that was good and decent about the United States. She was, of course, an exceptional woman anyway.
She had a wonderful reputation.
But the reputation in Europe, particularly at that time, was extraordinary. And I wrote a letter and said, I'm Karl Juraska, I went to the American school in Bulgaria, can you help me get into an American college? I need room, board, and tuition scholarship. I came with $10 in my pocket to the United States. Well, I actually got an answer, which I hadn't remembered anymore, but then I found in my files from a secretary. It was a male secretary, and it was a nice answer that gave me some advice and said, we'll see what we can do about it. And I didn't hear anything further about them. And maybe a year later, when I was going to Newark Community College during Christmas, in fact, it was Christmas of 1940, I got a postcard in the mail that you have been awarded a room, board, and tuition scholarship in Tarkio College, Tarkio, Missouri. I'd never heard of that college. It's Tarkio. Turns out that this is a college from which Wallace Carruthers, the discoverer of nylon, graduated.
Yes, of course.
So that was certainly, very few people knew about Tarkio. It's in the northwestern corner of Missouri. It was affiliated with Presbyterian Church in the middle of the Bible Belt. In fact, it's a small school, a small town, had more churches almost than it had, I think, houses. And I decided to accept that. I looked it up in a map first of all, but didn't know where Tarkio was. And took a bus. It was a mad bus ride. I remember went to Pittsburgh, changed in Pittsburgh to St. Louis, changed in Kansas City, changed in St. Joseph, Missouri, and finally get a small bus up to Tarkio. And I arrived there. And so that was a 4-year college. That immediately made me ineligible for the University of Chicago or the Kenyon scholarships, which I'd applied for, which were only for junior college graduates. I had, of course, not graduated from a junior college. I had left it after 1 year. So I spent only one semester there, which was the second semester of my sophomore year, or really first semester. I sort of was combining a couple of semesters. And then on my way back to New York, where my mother was living, I passed through Kenyon College in Ohio, in Gambia, Ohio, which is a beautiful place, beautiful college, and talked to people there, and they offered me a room, board, and tuition scholarship in spite of the fact that I was not a junior college graduate anymore, so I accepted that.
Yes, well, Kenyon had a reputation being a very fine liberal arts,
particularly in English, of course. And even that is sort of delayed response. At that time, we had an outstanding English department, published the Kenyon Review. John Crowe Ransom, the famous literary critic, was there. And I took some courses there in poetry. And 40 years later, I suddenly found myself writing poetry, and just a few months ago finished my first book of poetry. And earlier this year got my first poem accepted in a reputable poetry journal, so I've been very pleased, and several others have been accepted since. So there's this delayed response from Kenyon.
That's an amazing story. I think you're the first poet I have interviewed today.
But so I went to Kenyon, and that was during the war. I was not drafted. I was 4F because of a knee injury from a skiing accident, which in fact led to a fused knee. At that time I was sorry about it. It turned out to be a blessing in disguise because there were a lot of expedited programs, summer school and so on. So I finished college in about 2.5 years, and I was finished just about before my 19th birthday, partly because I skipped these 2 years of high school, partly because I went faster to college. So then I looked for, and I of course skipped something. In the process, became more interested in the basic science, in particular chemistry, and even though I'd taken all these pre-medical subjects, biology, chemistry, and so on, I decided to major in chemistry and not go to medical school, besides I couldn't afford it at that time anyway, and looked for a job, and I wrote to some of the pharmaceutical companies, And I picked the addresses just from the promotional literature that they were sending to doctors' offices. And I wrote a lot of them, and one of them was SIBA, the Swiss company in Summit, New Jersey, and got a job at SIBA and worked there for 1 year right after I got out of college when I was 19 years old. And again, I was very lucky because I was hired as a junior chemist, but I worked with a man considerably older than I, who also came from Europe, in fact, from Vienna, Charles Butterer. And together, he really treated me as an equal, and together we did a fundamental work on the first antihistamine, pyribentamine. So it was actually the first real research job that I completed, and a few years later, hundreds of thousands of, if not millions of allergy and hay fever sufferers used that. Well, that was pretty heady stuff for a young kid to see that research can be performed that quickly, and
the things that has happened in my life. By the way, I was just 80 years old on December the 3rd, so I've been here quite a while. I was born in Kentucky. My grandfather was a doctor, a country doctor in Kentucky. He was also a veteran of the Civil War, so-called war between the states, as we like to say in the South.
Oh, yes.
And he was a captain in Forest Cavalry for 4 years, and he fought, of course, the cause of the Southern Confederacy, and was wounded at the Battle of Shiloh. And he used to regale me with his exploits in the war when I was a little boy, when I'd go to Kentucky to see him. I was born in a small house on his tobacco farm that was built by my father and his brothers. And when I was 1 year old, the times were very hard, and my father heard about work in the neighboring state of Arkansas. And so he took my mother and me at the age of 1, and we moved to Arkansas. And we lived in Arkansas from the time I was 1 till I was 15 and a half. In the meantime, during that period, my mother died at the age of 9. And after about a year, my father married again, and so I had a stepmother in the place of a mother at that time. And things were not very pleasant around home, I'll put it that way, mildly. But I early learned to take care of myself because my father was a tailor and a cleaner and presser. And he taught me sometimes at the end of a stick how to do that.
Yes, well, you had a good start in life.
I had a good start in life.
And as a matter of fact, the coincidence is that you and Harry Truman got a somewhat similar start in life.
Well, yes, and I might tell you a short story about that. I was the honored guest at a homecoming in my hometown of Montebello, California, after I'd been in Congress a while, and one of the local Toastmasters who prided himself upon his ability to handle a meeting, he made a little speech, and he said, now, our congressman has 3 things in common with President Truman. This was during the time that Harry Truman was president. He said, they both married girls from Missouri. And he said, they both were in the haberdasher business before they were elected to Congress. And then they were both elected to Congress. Now, he said there's one distinction between the two, however. He said Congressman Hollifield made a success in business and Harry Truman went bankrupt. And my reply to that was, yes, but he became president of the United States, and I only got as far as a United States representative. And so the crowd enjoyed that little interchange.
That's a wonderful story, I think.
And I was very fond of Harry Truman. I admired him as many other people did. And when I was, as I said, when I was 15 and a half, I came to California, and I worked in various jobs, mostly at my trade in the cleaning and pressing business, which had been taught me because I could make about twice as much money there as I could in common labor. And then there was an opening for a little cleaning and pressing shop in a little oil town close to Los Angeles, just 10 miles east of there, and I heard about it from some friends of mine who lived there. And I went over and bought this little cleaning and pressing business. And I started then at the age of 17 as my own boss in a little cleaning and pressing shop. And I met a girl there in Montebello that I was very much attracted to. And so we were married in September before we were 19 years old in December and November. And so we got a pretty early start in life. And most people said, well, those kids don't know what they're doing, and this won't last very long. Well, it's lasted quite well. We just celebrated our 61st wedding anniversary just the other day on September the 14th.
That is fantastic.
And so those two young people, they knew what they were doing, I guess.
Yes, they both made very good choices.
Well, anyway, getting back to the business, I ran this cleaning and pressing business for a few years, and there were a lot of young men working in the oil fields, and they wanted stylish shirts and ties and things like that, and they asked me, why don't you put in a stock of haberdashery? So it sounded pretty good to me, and I put in a stock of haberdashery, and it wasn't long before my haberdashery business was outpacing my dry cleaning business, and I was making more money at that, and I finally gave up my dry cleaning, and then I was in the clothing business. And I was in the clothing business up until the Depression. I started in 1927 in the clothing business, and in 1931, the Great Depression, and it was a great one, hit California. It had started in Wall Street in the fall of 1929, and it gradually rolled west, and it finally hit California in the early part of 1931. We had, in the United States then, we had about 43 million workers on the rolls working, and we had over 13 million out of work. So we had 33 1/3% people that were unemployed. Now that sounds pretty bad, but it's worse than it sounds, because in those days we had no Social Security, we had no industrial pensions, we had no Medicare, we had none of the great social programs that later on was put into effect, first with President Roosevelt and then by successive presidents after him, both Democrat and Republican. And of course, when this depression hit me and my little bank folded, as thousands of banks folded in the United States in the 1930, 31, 29, 30, 31, and then when Roosevelt was elected in 1932, I listened to him on the radio. That was when the radios first came in, and I thought, this man talks the way I see things happening around me. The people of my town were out of work and they were hungry, and there was no place to go but the soup kitchens and a makeshift way, and they gleaned the fields and things like that. And so I became very much interested, because during that time I too was suffering from the economic depression. And to make a long story short, I lost my home, which I had already paid for. I lost my business during those 3 or 4 years of the Depression, and I became very active in politics as a result of that. And
I just born in Paris in 1912, and I had a brother very brilliant in mathematics. I was always told I wouldn't succeed in mathematics as well as my brother, so I decided not to do mathematics, and I chose to do chemistry, because I think when I was 12 or 13 I had a good note in chemistry. And I graduated in the school called École de Physique et Chimie de Paris, which is a school where at the end of last century Pierre Curie was a professor, and it is in the hangar of that, in the courtyard of that school, that the Curies discovered radium. But I had no intention to go towards radioactivity, and it was decided from the beginning that I would do a PhD in organic chemistry. The colors and the smell of organic compounds attracted me.
Yes, as I remember it, Dr. Goldschmidt, I believe Hahn, who did the work on radioactivity, started out in organic chemistry also. It's a good place to start.
No, I didn't start in organic chemistry, because a few weeks before I was graduating, the director of the school, which was Paul Langevin, who was a long-life friend of Marie Curie, called me and said that Madame Curie's personal assistant in chemistry had a tragic accident. He had drowned, and she was looking for a man who just graduated from school who would come and work with her. She had always chosen her assistants, her private assistants, in that school where she had worked and where her husband had taught. And Joliot, her son-in-law, who got later the Nobel Prize, also who came from that school. So that was in June 1933, and I had an interview with her, extremely intimidating. She looked very old. She was only 64 years old, but she looked much older. She looked very frail, and it was very strange. She didn't have a white lab coat, she had a black lab coat, so it gave, her face was very pale, her hair was very white, and she had a slight Polish accent still. And so she told me that I would be her slave for a year or two, and then afterward, and that's to show how mistakes can be done, she told me that as Hitler was now in power, anti-Semitism, which he had used to come to power, would probably vanish in Germany. And she was hoping by 1935 or 36 to send me 2 years at the laboratory of Hönig-Schmidt. It wouldn't matter because I'm Jewish, to send me at Hönig-Schmidt to do a very precise measure of the atomic mass of radium, which is a very difficult job, unfortunately, I never had to do, because anti-Semitism didn't vanish.
Yes, doing a job like that on radium would have led to frightful overexposures.
Probably. In any case, I had to do my military service in between 33 and 34. There was 1 year military service, and it was arranged that I would do part of it in a chemical warfare lab in Paris and go as often as I could Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon to start learning from her. And it's the only, I worked really very little with her. She taught me fractional crystallization, which is the work she had used to separate radium. And then by early 1934, probably a few weeks after the discovery of artificial radioactivity by her daughter and son-in-law, Frédéric Joliot and Irène Curie, she fell ill and she passed away in July 1934. So when I finished my military service that following October 34, I was taken exactly in the same conditions as personal assistant to André de Bierne, who was one of the last survivors of the discovery of radium. He had worked with the Curies since 1899 and had discovered actinium. So that's how I got involved in radioactivity, though I had never thought of being a specialist in that field. I must say that in those days, the chemist in a radioactive laboratory like the Curie Laboratory of the Radium Institute in Paris were kind of a second grade. The elite was the physicist. The chemist had to prepare sources for the physicist, and one had the impression that all the work on identifying all these natural radioactive elements had more or less been done. Yes, there was still one work was done at that time, a little later, the discovery of an embranchement which found element 87. That was annoying. But apart from that, there wasn't much in chemistry. And after 1 year working with de Bierne, I was liberated to do a PhD, and I did it on a very banal subject, which was the study in great detail of fractional crystallization of radium and barium salts and isomorphic crystals.
Yes, of course, at that particular time in in 1932, it may have seemed quiescent, but of course, I believe 32 was...
And that was the great year of the discovery of neutron by Chadwick and artificial radioactivity by the Joliot.
And then, of course, the invention of the cyclotron, which gave new tools, and so the field was just ripe for exploitation.
Absolutely. I remember when I, sometime after I arrived in the laboratory, two very brilliant foreigners arrived. One was Hans Halban, who came from Bohr's laboratory in Copenhagen. The other was Bruno Pontecorvo, who came from Fermi's laboratory in Rome. And I had sort of discussion with Halban, who said that I was losing time doing work on something so outmoded, and I would tell him that his work, if he didn't do it on neutrons, somebody would do it a few weeks later. While I knew that what I was doing, if I didn't do it, perhaps nobody would ever do it. Yeah. So that was a little... Once or twice, Joliot asked me to come and work with him, but I felt I had to keep faithful to the gentleman who had started me.
Fine.
Madame Joliot did with a little staff called Savic, where they were in contradiction with the work that Hahn, Strassmann and Liesmeiter were doing in Germany on the irradiation of uranium by neutrons. And really, I think that one can say that it's really Madame Joliot's work who put Hahn on the track of the discovery of fission. But it was very touch and go. She just missed the discovery herself. I remember all kinds of discussion on a certain element of 3.5 hours, which was not what Hahn had suggested, and which turned out finally to be, I think, an yttrium, an element of the mineral classification. In any case, I was not at all mixed up with the work on the discovery of fission. However, I remember being at the Collège de France in February 1940, when Joliot received a long 140 words telegram of Weisskopf, of Vicky Weisskopf, asking him to stop publishing on this field. And he had also received a few days before a letter from Zeeland, and at that time there was such a rush in publication that Joliot didn't agree. And you know, it was in March that he published with Halban and Kowarski the discovery of the secondary neutrons, followed a week later by Fermi and Zeeland. In any case, the war came, and the war found me in Tahiti. I had managed to do both a trip and a little bit of science in the same time. I had been given a mission with two of Pierre Auger's collaborators to measure the large showers of cosmic rays in between, on a great difference of latitude, in between Marseille and Tahiti. And we were doing a thorough measure in Tahiti when we learned that the wars had started. I was even mobilized in Tahiti for 2 weeks. The only thing I did was to take about 150 young Tahitians singing behind me to look for fern, to make beds out of fern, because there was not enough beds for the soldiers. So after some time, it was very clear, even if I wasn't going to stay in the army of the Pacific, and then we were sent back by a boat which took 45 days to come back with all kind of incidents on board. And we arrived in France, and I only arrived in November 1939, and there I learned that I was sent to a warfare gas laboratory in Poitiers, which is in the southwest of France. We were checking on the validity of gas masks for various possible poison gas. In May 1940, I had a leave of a week, and I was in Paris, and Joliot asked me to come and see him. And Joliot told me that the uranium work had taken a great importance, that it had a military importance, that he had been able to purchase in Norway the whole worldwide stock of heavy water, which was 185 kilos, and that there was great prospects, mainly in the direction of production of energy and probably of an engine which could be used for submarines. And he told me that he had asked the army to second me to his laboratory, and I would be asked to study the extreme purification of uranium to eliminate all the neutron-capturing impurities. This was exactly 2 days before the 10th of May, when the Germans invaded Holland, Belgium, and France. So naturally, I never got my order to join Joliot's laboratory in Paris. And finally, I was taken prisoner in Poitiers. As well, I was only a non-commissioned officer, very low rank, and there was 5,000 soldiers and non-commissioned officers which were taken prisoners in Poitiers. Out of those, there were 70 chemists working in that laboratory. And their first miracle is that there's 4 cities in southwest France where the Germans released the prisoners after about 10 days. We've never understood why. Because when we were released, we didn't even realize that we were an exception. I didn't rush away in the unoccupied zone. I stayed until one of my colleagues who had been prisoner, who was going back to France, very nicely came back to Poitiers to tell us that he had seen prisoners still behind barbed wires in other camps, and that we were an exception. So I passed easily in those days. The Germans hadn't really prepared the separation between the two zones. I passed at 4 in the morning from one zone to another, and went to Toulouse, where I knew some colleagues of mine of the Curie laboratory must have been. And there I saw a letter from Joliot saying that Halban and Kowarski had left France with, and there was a conventional name to say, with the heavy water. So I knew that had been saved.
That was very, very interesting point there. How much heavy water were you able to get from Norway before the invasion?
You see, the heavy water had been discovered by Harold Urey, I think in 1934. And Norway, where there was very cheap electricity, and where there was a firm called Norvégien de l'Azote. It was a firm.
I'm very much interested in your project that you're taping and recording around the country. Possibly it's well to start with a question or explanation of my educational background and how I happened to get into construction.
Very good. That would be a very fine place to start, Mr. Bechtel. So please include whatever background that you think is appropriate.
Well, it started in 1917 or 18 when I was in high school in Oakland, California. As a sophomore, I left high school and enlisted in the Army Engineers, and within 6 weeks was in France as a kid, 17 years old, and was there until the war was terminated some 19 months later, and had a wonderful time, I might comment. Learned a great deal.
Oh, I see. What part of the Army did you serve in?
Engineer Corps. Actually, I was a motorcycle dispatch rider, which meant that I was sent to dispatch various parts of France and somewhat of a freelance agent. And when the war was over, our group were sent home. I came back to home in Oakland, and it was about that time that my high school class had graduated from high school and were going to college, including a number of my friends who were going to the University of California, and suggested that this might be a thing for me to consider, which I said, well, that's a good idea. So I went out to the University of California, talked with the appropriate authorities, and explained to them that I had not graduated from high school. I had left when I was a sophomore, but I had put the last 2 years, about that time, in the engineer corps operations in France. And while it was largely a matter of practical applications, as contrast to technical, but nevertheless it was engineering. And asked whether I could be enrolled in the University of California. Well, after some discussion, they said, well, that's all right, you can enroll in engineering. And what they didn't tell me, and not that it made any difference at that time, but that I couldn't matriculate, I couldn't graduate. So I went to the University of California for 3 years, but as far as I could go under their rules, and then left the University of California and went into my father's company, old W.A. Bechtel company, and have been here ever since.
Oh yes, then you took engineering training then, however,
yes.
Of course, which of course I know from personal experiences, very high standards at the university.
Well, I've been more in touch with the University of California and their engineering group than most people have, because I've enjoyed the University of California and know considerable about it, and have helped them in some of the things that they are doing in engineering.
Yes, I know from talking to some of the people over there, they deeply appreciate your interest and your contributions to the University of California in the field of engineering. You've made a tremendous contribution there to the engineering curriculum.
Well, in the first work I got involved with my father, or for my father, was on railroad construction in the state of California. And then from railroads, we went into highway work as well as railroads. Then from railroad and highway, we went into pipeline construction. And one thing led to another. Each time we added a new dimension to our work. And that's the reason we've been so diversified through the years, because it's just an opportunity to expand, add more management to our organization, and go from there.
Yes, so you started primarily in the field of, we might say, transportation, and then diversified.
Well, we started in civil work largely, and later on went into mechanical and electrical and so forth. But actually, not being a technical engineer, in the technical sense of the word, it meant that we had to hire and did bring into the organization some very competent engineers, design engineers, and later on very sophisticated people.
Dr. Chairman came to know about me, and it turns out that he had realized I was interested in radio, and also had taken most of the other courses necessary in electrical engineering. And so he offered to let me take his graduate course in radio engineering, which was based on that textbook. And I was the first one first undergraduate who was was allowed to take that course, and so during my senior year, I attended this graduate course, and that, of course, really reinforced my commitment to want to spend my career in the field of radio engineering and electronics.
I'm very happy to hear you mention Dr. Terman, because I know my son has said that without Dr. Terman, there probably might not be a Silicon Valley. Valley today.
He was very influential, and I might tell you a little bit about that, because in the course of his interest in radio engineering, he became acquainted with almost all of the people who'd been pioneering in the industry, many of whom were right around this area, because there was some early work done by some Stanford graduates going clear back to the beginning of the century. And the Federal Telegraph Company was established here in Palo Alto based on the Pulson arc patents, which were obtained from Denmark by a Stanford graduate in about 1905, I believe. And then Dr. DeForest invented the vacuum tube here in Palo Alto in 1908. And
I had forgotten that originated in Palo Alto.
Oh yeah, well, and then Dr. Fritz Colster developed the radio direction finder in the 1920s. He lived in Palo Alto. And the Jensen loudspeaker was the first dynamic loudspeaker, and that company was established in Oakland.
Yeah, I think I have an old model of the Jensen still on my shelf.
And then Philo Farnsworth, at that time, was doing his work on his picture tube for television. And in the course of this study with Dr. Terman in radio engineering, he arranged visits for his students to go around and visit these companies. And this was a very intriguing experience, because we visited Charlie Litton, who had started a company up in Redwood City to build vacuum tubes, but he ended up concentrating his work on vacuum tube manufacturing machinery, glass blowing lathes, and so forth.
I remember the famous Litton glass blowing lathes. I used one.
Well, that was his contribution. And we visited Farnsworth's research project. It was up in San Francisco at the time. And this was during the Depression. And as we came along toward graduation in the spring of 1984, some concern about whether we were going to have a job. And Bill Hewlett and I had become friends as freshmen at Stanford, because we were both taking the same engineering courses, and so we've been in courses together for the 3.5 years or so.
Was Mr. Hewlett also involved in amateur radio?
No, Bill Hewlett was not involved in amateur radio. As a matter of fact, he had very little interest in radio until we got acquainted. He'd been interested in other things. But he developed his interest, again, really, under the influence of Dr. Terman. But in any case, Bill and I had talked about the possibility of starting a company ourselves. We talked about this in the fall of 1933, when I was first taking these courses here. And Fred gave us a little encouragement, because he said, well, look, a lot of these people who started these companies here that have been quite successful didn't have very much formal education in radio engineering, and he said, you and Bill have probably had more formal education, and there's no reason why you couldn't be more successful. Well, we weren't quite sure, but in any case, we were fully committed to the proposition that if we couldn't get didn't get a job that was satisfactory, that we'd undertake to do this ourselves. I was fortunate enough to get an offer to go to work for the General Electric Company. And being one of the very few jobs that was available in those days, it was too much of a temptation for me to give that up. So I agreed to take that job and went back to Schenectady, New York, in the spring of 1935.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I went through the same Depression years, and there were about 100 applications for every job.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I felt quite fortunate to be able to get a job at General Electric, and I think they hired 200 or 300 college graduates at that time from all over the country. And so I went back to Schenectady, and one interesting observation I made about that, when I got back to General Electric, my advisors recommended very strongly that I not get involved in electronics. They didn't think there was going to be any future in electronics, and they thought if I was going to be have a successful career in electrical engineering, I ought to concentrate in power generation or motors and some of those things. Well, I didn't agree with them, and so I went around myself and found an opportunity in the vacuum tube engineering department. It turned out that the advisors would help you get a location that you might be interested in, but you could also go around yourself and find something to do, which I was able to do. And so I spent most of my time, I remained there until 1938, in the vacuum tube engineering department. And we were working on mercury vapor rectifiers and ignitrons. But it was a very interesting experience because this vacuum tube engineering group was located in the same building as their main research laboratory there in Schenectady, New York. So I had a chance to be exposed to a good many distinguished scientists and people working on interesting things. So I had a little benefit of that acquaintance.
Yes, I believe that Coolidge wasn't Coolidge with General Electric Company.
There was Hall and Coolidge and Langmuir.
Oh, and Langmuir, of course.
All made very important contributions in the theory of vacuum tubes. And General Electric was involved in the manufacture of some radio type vacuum tubes, and they were making some large water cooled anode tubes and transmitting tubes there at the department. But during this period, Fred Terman kept in touch with me, and as a matter of fact, he would quite often travel to the east and visit his former students, and a good many of his former students had jobs in the various electronic industries there. A number of them at Bell Labs, at RCA, and there were several at General Electric. Bill Hewlett decided to do some graduate work, so he came out to MIT, and several times Bill and I would get together. We'd go skiing together, and sometimes he would come over, and we continued some discussion about this idea of eventually starting our own company during this interim period. I got married in 1938. A young lady that I'd met at Stanford, and in those days I couldn't afford to come back to San Francisco to get married, so she got on the train all by herself and came out to Schenectady, and we got married in the spring of that year. In the summer of 1938, Fred Terman worked out a research opportunity for me to come back to Stanford, and he recommended that I do this and take some additional work, and he said that a combination of what I'd done at General Electric and I did a little graduate work at the University of Colorado, he said that I could get my my engineer's degree. It was a double E degree in 1 year of residence instead of the usual 2 years of residence. And so we arranged to come back, and I had a very interesting project to work on an idea that Russ Varian had, which was a way of hopefully reducing the grid loss in a triode at high frequencies. And Fred Terman had arranged so that I could do this work up at Charlie Litton's laboratory, because it involved making one of these tubes to see whether it would work or not.
Yes, that's amazing because it was just about that time when the need for high frequencies was beginning to develop.
Well, that's right. And of course, the work on the klystron was being done over the physics department at Stanford, and there was a recognition that microwave would be very important for radar, and this was already known, and there was work being done in various areas. So there's quite a bit of emphasis on the development of better high-frequency technology at that time. Well, in any case, I took some courses, and Bill had found an apartment down on Edison Avenue. It's actually still there, with a garage, and so we set up a little shop in this garage, and we'd go to class in the morning, and we'd do some work in the garage, and trying to develop some things for our potential business. And then after dinner, I would go up and work in Charlie Litton's laboratory. And this worked out fine because he felt it was a waste of time to spend too much time in the office during the day. He said it was a waste of time with phone calls and so forth, so he wouldn't get started until maybe the middle of the day. But he'd work until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I would go up there and quite often work until midnight or 1 o'clock, and I was young enough then I could keep up with all of these things.
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating story because that was such an important development. The development and the invention and so forth came at about the right time in history.
Well, it's just quite often a matter of luck that you happen to be in the right place at the right time, and I think that Bill and I just happened to be involved in this industry at a time when it was really beginning.
64 or 5, just after I left the California Institute of Technology, I ran across work by 2 Canadian psychiatrists who were working in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and reported that they had got good results with schizophrenic patients by giving them vitamins. One vitamin, especially vitamin B3, nicotinic acid or nicotinamide. I wasn't especially interested because I think I was thinking of these vitamins as drugs.
Yeah.
And I hadn't been much interested in drugs. Plenty of other people work on drugs in the treatment of disease. But after a while, something occurred to me. This related to the amount of this vitamin that they gave the patients. This vitamin is extremely important. Back before 1920, there were hundreds of thousands of people in the United States and many in other parts of the world suffering from pellagra and dying from pellagra. And it was discovered at about that time that a glass of milk a day would prevent pellagra. And in the early 1930s, it was discovered at Wisconsin that that the substance in milk that prevents pellagra is nicotinic acid or nicotinamide, vitamin B3, usually called niacin.
Yes.
Well, a little pinch, 5 milligrams a day of this substance, either one of these 2 substances, will keep you from getting pellagra. It's a very powerful substance.
Very powerful.
Little pinch. Some of these psychiatric patients were being given 10,000 times that much. 50 grams, 50,000 milligrams a day. Well, 2 ounces, 50 grams, and without any side effects.
Well, that's amazing, because isn't one of the side effects of this increase in the metabolism leading to somewhat elevated temperature, or am I confused?
Well, nicotinamide does not have that effect.
Oh, I see.
Nicotinic acid is a vasodilator that causes flushing.
Flushing, yes.
If you take large amounts of nicotinic acid for 3 or 4 days, you will flush. Yeah. But from then on, you can continue to take the large amounts without flushing.
Oh, yes.
So that the flushing reaction does not prevent people from taking large amounts.
Oh, yes. So
but nicotinamide is nearly as good as nicotinic acid for the control of schizophrenia.
And no side effects.
Well, I thought this is really astonishing. that you can have a substance that has a physiological activity over such a broad 10,000-fold range of concentrations. Doctors prescribe aspirin for people with arthritis. And sometimes the amount of aspirin they take is such that if they took 5 times as much one day, they'd be dead, 5 or 10 times. Many patients die from the toxicity of the drugs that are prescribed for them, especially, of course, cancer patients, where the drug is given in amounts, the toxic drug is given in amounts as great as possible in the hope of controlling the cancer, and sometimes it's enough just by itself to kill the patient. Well, I thought, I'd never heard of anything like this. Here I am. Let's say this was 65, 64 years old and interested in the world, and I'd never heard of any substances that have a physiological activity at 5 milligrams, but are so innocuous that you can take 10,000 times that much day after day without being harmed.
Yes, you take vitamin D, for instance, and you take 1,000 times as much, it would kill you.
That's right. Presumably with vitamin D, some people say that it isn't a vitamin, but is a hormone because you can manufacture it, especially if you go out in the sun. The other vitamins too are not very toxic, because I found when I looked into them, nobody has ever died from an overdose of vitamin A, which is often referred to as a dangerous substance. Yes. People get headaches or sometimes get nauseated from an overdose. Well, vitamin C, it turned out, when I looked into the matter, has value for schizophrenics too. Milner showed that it is beneficial. And here again, you can take 10,000 times as much vitamin C as is required to keep you from developing scurvy without any serious side effects.
It has that broad range.
I thought, as I say, I'd never heard about substances of this sort. And I thought, why don't we ask how much you should be taking to be in the best of health? The Food and Nutrition Board tells us about the RDAs, the recommended intakes. And if you read what they say these are the amounts that will keep you from dying.
Yes,
they don't say these are the amounts that put you in the best of health. And if you have a 10,000-fold range of concentrations that you can investigate, why not find out what the optimum intakes are? And then I thought, this needs a name. Why don't I call these substances orthomolecular substances, meaning the substances with the right molecules, and say that if you use them, you are dealing with orthomolecular medicine, prophylactic or therapeutic use of these orthomolecular substances. So I wrote a paper, Orthomolecular Psychiatry, and then later collaborated with a psychiatrist to edit a big book, Orthomolecular Psychiatry, Treatment of Schizophrenia, in which these arguments are brought out in detail. And of course, I got into an argument with a professor of medicine who was very vituperative about my statement that large doses of vitamin C will keep you from developing the common cold. And it turned out when I continued correspondence with him that he was just unwilling to look at the evidence. He just rejected the evidence. He was so hidebound that I had gone to the medical literature to find out what the situation was generally. And I found out that the textbooks in medicine misrepresented the situation in the same biased way. And by that time, I had got so interested in the whole story about vitamins that I sat downstairs in my study here during the month of August, between the 1st and the 31st of August in 1970, and wrote my little book, Vitamin C and the Common Cold, which came out in November of that year. So then later, in my reading, I'd run across work on vitamin C and cancer, early work. work, which had been pretty much ignored, just as the work on vitamin C and wound healing has been ignored by the medical profession. The vitamin C and cancer remained in my mind when I was asked by Charlie Huggins to come to give the principal address at the dedication of his new cancer research laboratory in the University of Chicago Medical School, Pritzker Medical School. Theselius in Sweden had been invited to give this talk, but had become ill and couldn't come. So Huggins asked me a week before the affair to come, and I thought, what can I talk about? Well, I remember the book by a surgeon named Ewan Cameron, who had written this book in 1966. He had been interested in cancer after having served for a year in the cancer hospital. And although he was a general surgeon with some cancer patients, he kept asking himself, isn't there something we can do about this disease? And he kept trying hormones. This is for patients with the kinds of cancer that hormones have not been shown to be beneficial for, and other things, and always was disappointed. Nothing worked. In his book, which had the title Hyaluronidase and Cancer, he expressed a general principle that if we could strengthen the normal tissues, that might help them to resist infiltration by a growing malignant tumor. And I remembered, I had thought, we know something that strengthens tissues. The intercellular cement contains fibrils of collagen, which strengthen it the way that reinforcing rods strengthen concrete, reinforce concrete. And we know that the more vitamin C you take, the more collagen you synthesize. It's required for the synthesis of collagen.
Is that any relationship to the use of vitamin C and perhaps in speeding healing of even simple wounds?
Oh, yes. Collagen synthesis.
Same principle.
Yes, if you're not synthesizing collagen, the wounds won't heal.
Yes.
So a high intake of vitamin C causes the wounds, helps the wounds.
I know,
to
and
heal.
whenever I get some cuts, I always take more vitamin C.
So I thought, well, there's something I can say. So when I gave my talk in Chicago, I made this statement, and I said, looking at some epidemiological material that I found, I estimate that with the proper use of vitamin C, we could cut the mortality from cancer by 10%. A little article about my talk appeared in the New York Times, and someone sent it to Ewan Cameron in Scotland. He wrote to me asking how much vitamin C he should try.
Isn't that amazing?
So I wrote saying 10 grams a day. This was in 1971. So he took a hopeless cancer patient and gave her 10 grams a day of vitamin C by intravenous infusion in the hospital. And she responded in such a remarkable manner that she wanted to go home and did go home, and he arranged that she would be able to take 10 grams a day in a syrup that he prepared at home. So he tried another patient, and this patient also responded in a remarkable manner. More energy, the feeling of being miserable that these patients had went away. They had good appetites, and of course, so I went over to see Cameron, and they went back, and after a couple of years I said, do they live longer than the other patients? And he said, well, he was sure. He thought they lived twice as long after reaching the untreatable stage, the terminal stage.
But the quality of life.
But the quality of life was much different, yes, much better. So we set up a study in which the first 100 terminal cancer patients who had been given vitamin C were compared with 1,000 matched terminal cancer patients
who had not received vitamin C but were in the same hospital. They were matched 10 with the same kind of cancer, same sex and age. It turned out that the ones who didn't receive vitamin C died within 2 months after, on the average, after reaching this terminal stage when treatment was essentially stopped except palliative supportive treatment. And the ones who received vitamin C lived about a year, 5 or 6 times as long.
That's amazing.
And some of them are still alive.
Yes.
There are even a couple, I think, of this first 100 who are still alive 10 years later, after having been considered to be terminal. But most of them felt better and lived considerably longer.
Is this the main direction of your work then at your Stanford Institute?
Yes, we do work on the biochemistry of vitamin C, to some extent of other vitamins, on animal. We study cancer in animals as affected by intake of vitamin C and also other vitamins. And we have some general work similar to what other people are doing on genetics of cancer, the DNA, genetic material characteristic of cancer, trying to find out just what happens that causes a cancer to begin to develop. And here there is a lot of competition, many other people doing the same thing. And then we are also working on other medical problems. We've started the study of cataract formation in the elderly and are just starting a study of nephritis to see if it might not be possible to keep a good fraction of the people who go on a kidney machine from having to go on the kidney machine.
Oh, yes.
And I'm very interested in that because I've heard there are 50,000 people in the United States on kidney machines at a cost of about $5 billion a year.
Yes, that's the figure I have heard also, and if you could cut it down 5%, it would be tremendous.
I said the other day, I am pretty sure it would be possible to cut it by 10% if you could get people to do it.
Yes.
If you could get the physicians to agree.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was just talking with Hal Holman, professor of medicine, formerly head of the Department of Medicine at Stanford, about this, and he is checking up on the nephrologists in Stanford about their possible interest in collaborating with us.
Yes.
I have a couple of ideas as to what to do. Well, one, of course, involves vitamins.
Yeah, so that's it. But with respect to that, I cannot help but give the comparison with regard to the controversy that you mentioned in connection with some of these, that the theories of Pasteur were resisted. So he was a chemist, of course, and his theories were resisted tooth and nail by the standard medical profession.
Right.
And here you are, 100 years later, you've got another quite similar situation in some respects. Although I gather that there's much more acceptance of some of your things than Pasteur encountered during his lifetime.
Yes. Well, I was very flattered 20 years ago, or around 20 years ago, when I received the medal of the city of Paris, the Vermeil medal from the mayor, whatever it is called, a nice big shiny medal.
Yeah.
And what flattered me was that the speech that he delivered was a comparison of me with Pasteur.
Oh, is that right? Well, as I said, I feel in good company then. I'll even in bringing this up. Fine.
Well, this, as I say, with